Hi, everyone. We're going to get started momentarily. If you're just joining us, welcome. We're excited to have Jackie back for part 2 of this session today. And along with her presenting will be Josh DeVincenzo both from the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at the Earth Institute at Columbia. So if you're just joining us, give us another minute. We'll wait for a few more people to join us, and then we will get started. As a reminder, if you could use the chat box just for questions for the presenters as they go throughout as they go through their presentations. We'll be monitoring that very carefully. And if you do have any questions about technical difficulties or other sessions or anything else related to EI Live programming, please feel free to email me directly. So it is 2 o'clock, so let's get started. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. This is our second EI Live session for K-12 students and educators. And as I mentioned, this is brought to you by the Earth Institute at Columbia University. For those who may not be familiar with the Earth Institute, we are a research organization within Columbia that blends research in the social and physical sciences, education, and practical solutions to guide the process of sustainable development. Experts that make up the Earth Institute include earth scientists, economists, business and policy experts, specialists in public health and law, research staff, teachers, and students. The Institute is made up of more than 24 research centers and several hundred people who work and collaborate across many different disciplines and schools within Columbia University. What we're hoping to do with these EI Live sessions for K-12 students and teachers is to introduce everyone to our interdisciplinary work through presentations and demos by our experts. Over the next couple of months, we're going to feature a variety of these sessions for K-12 students and teachers, and we'll also be building on the EI Live series to include other content, so stay tuned for that. The title of today's session is In a Disaster, the Buck Starts Here. So this is part 2. Part 1 was on Monday, and the video for that is actually ready. So if you're interested in seeing that, and in case you didn't sign up for that event, just shoot me an email and we will happily share that recording with you. As I mentioned, our presenters are Jackie Ratner and Josh DeVincenzo from the National Center for Disaster Preparedness. They'll be discussing a very relevant topic with us today, which will help us understand the big picture of how disasters affect the economy in both direct and indirect ways. We'll have Jackie and Josh do their presentation, and then we'll open it up to questions towards the end of the presentation. As I mentioned, if you do have a question, please type it into the chat box to the right of this video or just email me directly. Once the session is done, we'll share a link with everyone who registered for the event so that you can access the recording later on. We appreciate your patience with us as we move to online content delivery, figuring out the best practices. So without further ado, Jackie and Josh, if you want to take it away.
Thank you, Cassie. Hi. I just want to check. You can hear me okay, Cassie?
Perfect. Yep.
Great. Okay, fantastic. Hi, everybody. My name is Jackie Ratner. I am the Senior Project Manager at the National Center for Disaster Preparedness. And I'm here to present, as Cassie said, with my colleague Josh about the financial aspect of disasters. So how we pay for disasters, how they affect the economy. And Josh is going to talk in particular about the business case for disasters, so businesses and disasters. So we've got a cartoon that just happens to have the exact phrase that we're using for this series, the buck stops here. In this case, the buck starts here. We're curious about the flow of money in disasters. We'll start by talking about how much disasters cost, and the answer, as you can imagine, is a lot. Disasters cost a lot of money, hundreds of billions of dollars. You can see that since 1980, the number of disasters across America has been increasing, and the amount of the cost has also been increasing over time. So it's important to notice that this graph, which is from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency, because of the agency that it's from, it does not cover disasters like a pandemic. It only covers climatological disasters. So you'll see here that includes drought, wildfire, flooding, winter storm, severe storm is something like a hurricane instead. And so even with all of that, we can imagine, since it doesn't include everything, we can imagine that there's actually even more costs on top of it. So we want you to take away from this, disasters are very expensive, and they cost an average of $106 billion per year over the last 5 years. That doesn't mean that it was $106 billion every year for the last 5 years, because some years we have bigger disasters than others. If you remember, 2017 was a really big year for hurricanes. But we know that the costs are going up over time. And so we're here to talk about how that affects everybody. So when we talk about who it affects, we're talking about stakeholders. Stakeholders is a word for everybody who's involved in some way. So for a disaster, stakeholders, it's just about everybody, as you can imagine. So when a disaster happens, we're impacted on the individual and household level. Businesses are affected, nonprofits are also affected, and all levels of government. So government at the local level, the state level, and also the federal level. So these are all stakeholders. Everybody has a role to play, and everybody stands to be affected by the disaster. In case you weren't with us on Monday, we'll give a brief overview of the disaster cycle. So the disaster cycle is the way that we think of the ebb and flow of disasters. So it's easy for people who aren't thinking about it every day, like me and Josh. It's easy to forget about disasters when one hasn't happened in a while. But it doesn't mean that we are not thinking about disasters at all. It just means we're in a different part of the disaster cycle. So as you can see here from the diagram, we can think of the disaster cycle as starting with a disaster occurring. So that's the lightning bolt. Then the first thing that happens is response. Response is what we do immediately after a disaster. Last time on Monday, we talked about the way that works in government. So we talked about legislation and the types of things that might happen immediately after a disaster. In the longer term, so now we're talking weeks, months, and the first couple of years after disaster, we call that recovery. So we're trying to get back to a place of normalcy after a disaster, whereas response is more like immediately, what do we need to do to fix as much of the problem as we can? Recovery is the longer term process of trying to get back to normal. Recovery starts to blend into mitigation. So mitigation is a word that we use when we talk about trying to decrease the potential effects of a future disaster that hasn't happened yet. So as you can imagine, every disaster, we're able to learn something from that, and we're able to apply that to the future plans. And then preparedness, prevention and preparedness might sound really similar, and they are pretty similar. Preparedness is more specific. So for instance, having an emergency fund is a type of preparedness. It's not going to help you decrease a disaster in the future, but it'll help you get through it. So here's some examples as well of the types of financial things that might be happening at different phases in the disaster cycle. So in response, and we talked about this last time again, in response, something that might happen immediately after a disaster is appropriations. So the government deciding how they're going to start spending money in response to the disaster. On a smaller scale, a business or an individual or a household might decide to start cutting their costs. So that would be a response, a financial response to the disaster. In terms of recovery, so what's something that's a little bit more long-term? We might see stakeholders, so stakeholders, again, it could be at any level, taking out loans. So we could see people borrowing money to try, for instance, a business could take a small business administration loan to try and get the business through till the economy recovers. We also see loans being offered. So we see private businesses offering loans. We also see the government starting to offer loans. And that's all to help with recovery specifically. Insurance is something that we can talk about as being a type of mitigation. So when we apply for an insurance policy, that's helping mitigate our future risks. So it's not mitigating the disaster. Something might still happen, but we might be able to already have a plan in place so that we don't take such drastic financial measures after a disaster. We have a little bit of insurance. Oftentimes when we talk about a big disaster, you see a lot of numbers thrown around. So someone might say, well, this hurricane cost $300 billion. And I don't know about you, but I've wondered before, well, where does that number come from? How do we know? How do we know how much it costs? Is it the cost of the buildings and the infrastructure that was destroyed? Is it also the cost of the people who can't go to work and the wages that they lost? There is actually a way to start to think about it. So we call it direct versus indirect impacts. So we have a disaster, which here in the diagram is the smallest circle. And in this example, we're talking about a tornado. The disaster itself has some sort of direct impact. So for instance, a direct impact could be that the tornado causes a tree to fall on a restaurant. It's very direct. It's immediately related to the tornado, both in space and in time. Now, as an indirect impact, we might say that the restaurant has to close. Now, the restaurant doesn't have to close because of the tornado. The restaurant has to close because the tree fell on it. And that's a really important distinction, both because it's harder to prove that the restaurant closed as a result of the tornado. It's easier to prove that it closed because of the tree. And also indirect impacts have a ripple effect. They ripple out from the space and time that the disaster happened, and we see them continuing to ripple out even for years after a disaster. We still sometimes see some of the effects. And so some of those long-term indirect impacts, for instance, people aren't spending as much money, that can be really hard to measure. So what's important to remember about a disaster and its direct impact versus its indirect impact are that the direct impacts are easier to measure and they happen faster, usually related immediately to the disaster, whereas the indirect impacts can be harder to measure and they can last a lot longer after the disaster as well. So those are all parts of what makes it difficult to estimate how much a disaster is truly going to cost. But now on a smaller scale, it's actually a little bit easier to figure out how much a disaster is going to cost. And these are the types of things that it's very important to think about at every point of the disaster cycle. So we don't just want to start thinking about the cost of a potential disaster in the response phase. We also want to be thinking about it in prevention, mitigation, and preparedness before a disaster happens. So to talk more in depth about the way that we have to consider our financial situation before a disaster, I'm going to introduce my colleague, Josh DeVincenzo, and he's going to talk about two made-up people, John and Neela. So go ahead, Josh, take it away.
Great, thanks, Jackie. And I think I need to stop dressing like our cartoon character, John, just so people know it's a hypothetical character. But first, before I kind of get into the accounting equation and how we use that in understanding businesses and businesses' positions in disasters, I first want to just thank all the educators and the students that are joining today. I know that there's just a lot going on right now, and I'm happy that we're able to do this even virtually, and that thank you very much for all the work that you're doing out there. So in terms of the accounting equation, and when we got this topic of talking about economic recovery and just the economy in general and disasters, and that we were going to be speaking with 10th to 12th graders and a broad audience, we figured let's just use some of the similar things that we have in our everyday conversations with businesses, emergency managers, government, because at the foundation, these are financial literacy concepts that are just really important to understand to make sense of some of these very complex things, especially in the context of COVID-19. So the accounting equation, don't worry, you don't need a calculator today. We're not going to be doing any type of calculations, but it's more of a symbolism and representation of what we need to keep in mind, what businesses need to keep in mind as well. So you can look at this from the vantage point of an individual, a family, or this is very common practice in business to just have a comfortable gauge of assets, liabilities, and equity. And we're going to spend some time going left to right of what each means and how they relate to what happens when a disaster occurs. Jackie, next slide, please. Thank you. So first, we're going to start with assets. Assets are a little bit more fun to talk about because assets are essentially what we have. Assets come in a lot of forms. We're thinking strictly in monetary terms right now. So assets, first and foremost, are cash, a savings account, which we'll talk a little bit about of how important savings at a business level, as an individual level, is important and throughout, even when a disaster is not occurring. Savings is essential. Inventory, so businesses will often carry inventory if that is the type of industry that they're in. Businesses have several different types of models, but inventory does count as an asset. It's what they own as well as the equipment. So if you're thinking about a restaurant, their freezer is one example of equipment. It's an asset. Property, securities, and investments all make up this broader idea of assets. So why are assets so important? Assets are so important because they can be liquidated to cash. And what we'll find out in disasters, the ease of liquidating assets to cash becomes very crucial. So in scenarios where we do need cash, whether it's to pay wages to our employees, for example, if we have an asset that is easily turned to cash, then we're a little bit better off than one that might take a little bit more time. One example of that would be if a business needed to sell, we'll go back to the freezer example. So let's say they have to sell a freezer or a special type of oven. It might take more time because they need to find a buyer for that, and then that will become cash. Whereas a savings account would be one of the easier ones where we can just move money around through a transaction. So this is very essential to understand what you have. Next slide, Jackie. Liabilities, so the not so fun one to talk about. So liabilities is just a fancier way of saying what you owe. Not all liabilities are bad. This is a conversation that you might encounter later on in your career, so careers are wherever you go into, because liabilities can be leveraged, especially starting out by businesses. But what we'll see soon is that if liabilities go unchecked, and when we talk about liabilities, these are loans, these are debts. If we're talking about individuals, for example, this could be credit card debt. It's rent, it's mortgage, it's money that's going to go out the door. Whereas assets, money that we're keeping in, that the money that we own, liabilities is going out the door. And they have an interesting way, and we'll have another visual showing this, of accumulating in times of disaster. Next slide, Jackie. Equity. So equity can also be looked at as net worth. It's one of the clearest indicators of how healthy a business is, or how healthy an individual's finances are. So to get equity, we take assets, remember that's what we own, and subtract liabilities, what we owe, and that gives us net worth, or equity, of what is left over. So this is really the realistic understanding of what's going to be left over, and how well established a business will be in case a disaster were to occur. We can't rely on just assets alone, because if we don't subtract the liabilities, that number is just going to be off. And what we'll find out with finances in disaster context, it's very important that we're as accurate as possible with a realistic understanding of what our resources are. Next slide, please. So what do you, maybe we'll do this as a quick exercise at home. Unfortunately, we can't do much interaction here, but maybe take a second and think, what do you think happens into the accounting equation during a disaster? If you have a pen or a pencil nearby, maybe give your best guess. What do you think would happen to assets if a disaster were to happen? Let's use a hypothetical of a tornado. I think Jackie used that example earlier. So a tornado happens and wipes out a business, or drastically impacts a business. We won't say wipes them out completely, but we'll say they're heavily impacted. What do you think will happen to their assets? Will it go up or down? Maybe take a second to take a guess there. Perfect. We will move on to liabilities. So this is, again, what we owe. In the case of this tornado, what we owe, will it go up or down in most cases with a disaster? And then finally, equity. This one might be a little bit tougher, but equity, what is left over? Is this going to go up or down? Okay, so I'll trust that everyone's jotting down notes or giving their best guess. And in the next slide, we will figure out what the relationship between the accounting equation is in the context of a disaster that impacts a business. So we'll see here that if you put assets go down, that was the correct answer. If you put liabilities go up, that was also the correct answer. And if you put equity goes down, that was the correct answer. And it's important to notice here that assets and equity are very closely linked and are almost interconnected in a way. So both of them, if assets are going down, equity is going to go down with it. Liabilities, unfortunately, what we owe, what we incur in terms of loans or debt, tends to go up. So this is a pretty balanced triangle that we have here of just the common expectation for what our finances, what a business finances would look like in the case of a disaster. But what we'll see in the next slide is that if liabilities prior to the disaster go unchecked or unmonitored, so say that our business owes a lot of money, we can see that a disaster will just drastically increase our liabilities. This will bring assets and equity in a less balanced way. So we have that blue balance triangle of, this is the expectation. It's hard to avoid losing any assets or losing any equity if we get a direct impact to our business as a result of a disaster. But we didn't see the same or as dramatic increase in liabilities that we do with an organization or a company that already had a significant amount of liabilities. They shoot up. And what's unfortunate with this is the fact that we will rely heavily on increasing our liabilities, and unfortunately that creates a cycle of borrowing for many businesses.
Sorry, Josh, sorry to interrupt. We had a quick question come up about the slide that you had shown. The question was specifically about why, this one here. So assets go down, equity goes down. Why do liabilities go up? That was the question.
Excellent question. And we're going to walk through an example, a hypothetical example. You're going to see my twin, John, come back, and we'll go through what John's business is like and why his liabilities went up potentially. But the reason liabilities will go up is usually to cover damages. So if it's an unexpected expense, for example, flood damage, and that will be the example we'll talk through. That flood damage was not in our projections. It wasn't in our budgeting. And it's very often the case that a business won't actually have cash on hand in their assets to cover an expense like that. So that's when liabilities do increase, whether it's getting a loan from a bank, from the government. That becomes money that we owe, and that's why we will tend to see liabilities go up. Or so I think that would be the best way to explain that. And we'll go into a little bit more of a detailed narrative around what that looks like in a business context. But great question.
Great, thank you.
No problem. Right on cue. I should not have worn this shirt, but we're going to be talking about two hypothetical businesses, and the aim here to do this narrative and this walkthrough is to show that no two businesses will experience a disaster the same. So when we think of the context of COVID-19, for example, and just the drastic impact that it's had on businesses across the country and around the world, no two businesses are really going to experience the impacts of that in the same manner, depending on really what their financial, what that accounting equation looked like, what that A equals L plus E looks like. So to illustrate that, we're going to take John's pet shop. So John is a pet shop owner, and Neela's bakery. Next slide, please. So what we'll see here is that John and Neela both experienced a flood damage. In the previous slide, you saw they were underwater. So both their pet shop, John's, both the pet shop as well as the bakery, let's say there's two stores right next to each other, experienced the same amount of flood damage. The direct impact of that damage, let's say it impacted their basement as well as storage. So as Jackie had mentioned early on in the presentation, those direct damages are a lot easier to see. They're a lot easier to visualize, and they're a lot easier to address right away. So we could put a price tag, which we will in the next slide, on what those direct impacts will cost our business. The indirect impacts are ongoing. So let's say that we're going to take out a loan to cover the flood damage. The indirect impacts are most closely related to our ability to repay the interest on that loan for months to come after that direct impact, as well as decisions that we'll have to make as a business of, do we pay down the loan that we have on our flood damage, or do we cut back on inventory? Do we change our compensation structure for our employees? So these are a lot of difficult questions that a business will have to navigate after a disaster. And again, having a very healthy understanding of what the assets are, the liabilities, and of course the equity of the company is very important. So we're going to look at a side-by-side of John and Neela's finances. Again, no need for a calculator. We did much of the math for you here. So John and Neela, and just to go off script here too, just really quickly, when we talk about businesses like this, it often becomes difficult because we are evaluating them basically only on their finances and only their money. But we need to understand behind these figures here, John and Neela are both passionate business owners, for example, whether it's the bakery or the pet shop. And there's a human component that none of these numbers will actually be able to cover for us in detail. And so when we do have these conversations with businesses, it's always important to be cognizant of it goes beyond just their finances. But however, their finances are an easy way for us and different people that are engaged in economic development, economic recovery, to at least begin the conversation of what needs to happen to improve these situations, these really, really drastic situations post-disaster. So what we're going to see here is John and Neela's finances. And as I promised, no calculator, but if you keep an eye on where is there more red, you'll notice that John definitely has more red. So we're going to break this down really quickly. So this is an oversimplified balance sheet. And even in the name balance sheet, is the goal for businesses, the goal for individuals is to have a really healthy balance. We're going to see here in John's scenario that it's not necessarily a healthy balance here. We're seeing that there's a good amount of liabilities. So for the flood damage that we talked about in the original case of John and Neela, both their shops experienced flood damage. We're going to say that their flood damage cost them $2,000. So both of them experienced the same amount of damage, $2,000 to their storefronts. To pay for this, and going back to that great question that came about, why did liabilities increase? John and Neela decided both to get a loan to cover the expenses. So the loan came at $1,500 to cover the expenses. And then you can see here, these are the losses that both John and Neela's businesses took based on the loan that they decided to take out. Of course, this is a little bit simplified as the loan will come with an interest rate. If we really want to get into the weeds there, John would probably have a much higher interest rate than Neela because of all the liabilities that he currently is carrying. So in terms of a lender, John is a much higher risk than Neela. So his experience is going to be a lot more difficult. John is definitely more of that red triangle that we saw earlier, and Neela is a little bit more of that balanced triangle. So we see that John and Neela both have the same amount, about $10,000 in assets, so what they own. Their liabilities, however, John, you can see, had $8,900 in liabilities before the flood. So he owed a significant amount of money before the flood. So his equity is down by around $1,100. Neela, on the other hand, owned a lot more than she owed. So she only owed around $1,500 here, where her equity is coming out very much on top here at $8,500. So she was situated very well to handle this economic disruption to her business. It's a loss regardless. So assets and equity are coming in on the triangle, but she is not necessarily no pun intended, underwater in this circumstance, whereas John might be. So when we think about our communities, and this is very visible in the context of the pandemic, there are businesses that are going to be more well equipped to handle the recovery phases, and others that will need some support. Whereas it's really important to understand for many of these businesses that their financial situations prior to COVID-19 or prior to a hypothetical flood really jurisdicts how they're going to be able to navigate and ultimately how they're going to be able to recover from disasters. So having these conversations around assets, liability, and equity are not only important for businesses, but even individuals and households of, can we pad a savings account? Do we have, what do our assets look like? What do our liabilities look like? And what's left over? So this is, again, the accounting equation. It's a fun, it's a fun way to appraise just the amount of risk, as well, and we can take more of the positive side of that. We can appraise the amount of security that a business might have in terms of having the ability to recover from disasters. Next slide. And then now I'm going to hand it over to Jackie. As I mentioned, that there's going to be a lot of different avenues in which companies, businesses are able to take advantage of different funding structures. And so Jackie's going to talk a little bit about that and how that impacts the accounting equation ultimately.
Sorry, Josh, I'm going to interrupt you again because I think there's a few specific questions about the slides that you just did, which is why before Jackie starts her section, I wanted to make sure that we get to, let's see here, there's one question about why doesn't GDP get decreased every time the assets get destroyed. The other question is about if I should accept an asset depreciation because of a force majeure effect, why wouldn't my liabilities also suffer a similar loss balancing the accounting equation?
Yeah, so it sounds like there might be an accountant out there if we're talking about some asset depreciation there. So I think what we wanted to achieve with this was more of a foundational understanding of how these are interrelated. Some of those specific questions I would be happy to take offline, especially because it will get into more the technicalities, and for this audience specifically is more introduction to these concepts and the relationship there. But I think the idea of asset depreciation is a good one to include in this conversation. For folks that are listening, asset depreciation is really important in terms of how oftentimes we will actually miscalculate our assets. So we might think that we have more in this asset column than we actually have. Asset depreciation, the age-old way of illustrating that would be the analogy of driving a car off the lot. So you buy a brand new car, and let's say it's worth like $28,000. The second you drive that car off the lot, it becomes depreciating in value because you've sat in the car is now going to get road wear, and it's just not the same car that you bought it at, not the same quality car that you bought it when it was on the lot. So noting that your assets many assets will depreciate in value is very important, because we might think that in our assets column we're calculating as, oh, that's still that $28,000 car, but in actuality, when we're going at, say, a disaster happened and we're appraising what we own and what we versus what we owe, we can see that car might be more worth around let's say $23,500. So there's an interesting dynamic in the value of goods. And that is its own lecture. And again, whoever asked that question, I'd be happy to take that offline around what that looks like in the case of a disaster. But we do want to keep it somewhat foundational here without going too far into the weeds.
Okay, thank you, Jackie.
Yep, no
All right, here we go. Okay, hello again. Thank you very much, Josh, for bringing all of that to our audience today. I'm hoping that those specific examples helped kind of illustrate the way that some of this works. And again, it doesn't just have to be, as Josh said, for a business, it can also be for an individual, for a household. And now this concept of the accounting equation, it's all very much in mind when our government takes action in a disaster. And so the government is also trying to balance their balance sheet. And so there's a couple different things that happen, and we're going to use what's going on actually right now in history. In this moment in history, we're going to talk a little bit about the COVID-19 pandemic and what's happening with the stimulus packages for that. So right after a disaster happens, again, if you'll remember the disaster cycle, the first thing that happens is response. So response is something that's very immediate. And what the government does is they start appropriations. So appropriations are when Congress, which is the Senate and the House of Representatives, make a decision that they're going to take money from someplace and spend it on a specific issue. For us in America, we have a disaster relief fund. We haven't had it that long. For a long time before we had a disaster relief fund, there had to be some sort of specific event, and then the state or the city had to request a specific amount earmarked for a specific thing. So for instance, they could say, we're going to need exactly $55 million to rebuild exactly 10 buildings. Now it's a little bit broader because we're starting to understand more about the complexity of indirect impacts. So our disaster relief fund in 2019 was worth $29 billion. If you remember back to the very, very beginning of everything, 2019 on average was about $106 billion in disaster costs. So how are we covering it? In part, we do have a cost sharing requirement between the federal government and state governments. So essentially, the federal government can help bolster the economy, and it can help give disaster response and recovery aid to states, but it comes with a little bit of strings attached, saying that the states also have to take some of that responsibility and use some of the state money to also cover it. So there's a little bit of a cost share there. In 2018, the Disaster Relief Fund was expanded so that it was, now you're allowed to use that money, you're allowed to appropriate that money for mitigation and preparedness. So if you look, this is the bottom right part of the disaster cycle, the response. Now we're going all the way back up to the top, which is where mitigation and preparedness is. That's really, really significant, because what we know is we know that mitigation and preparedness saves money in the long run, but it's difficult to justify sometimes spending money on that in the short term. So now that we can do that legally with the Disaster Relief Fund, that's really significant. But we are not in prevention and mitigation right now, are we? We are in disaster response. So the pandemic is very new still. We're still responding to it. We've not yet reached a period of recovery, but the stimulus packages that have been coming out are intended to help us through that recovery phase and to mitigate the overall disaster. So on March 6th, $8.3 billion were allocated for the coronavirus response. $8.3 billion sounded like so much money on March 6th. And as it turned, and that was really kind of for the immediate needs that were becoming clear at that time. As the days went on, so really not very long after that, but each day I'm sure you've experienced can sometimes feel like an eternity now. I did see something that that said that, you know, I've lived through several decades, the 1990s, the early 2000s, 2010s, and then March. So March has certainly felt like a very long month. So it became clear that we were going to need a lot more than $8.3 billion. So then Congress passed the Families First Act, which freed up additional money, and then came the CARES Act, which added on to the Families First Act. You'll notice it's an acronym. The CARES Act is an acronym for the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Package. And it is $2.3 trillion. Sometimes that's a hard number to conceptualize, so I added all the zeros to it for your benefit. And that's supposed to help us get through not just response, not even just recovery, but all the way through to mitigation. So it's an enormous amount of money, but it's also supposed to do a lot more than just disaster response. So what's it supposed to do? So the CARES Act, as we've said, is absolutely gigantic. And so the money has to be appropriated from somewhere. So some of that money is coming in on the left over here. You can see where it's coming in from. And then it's going out to the right. So who's going to be receiving it? $610 billion are going out to households. We see some relief going to large businesses and small businesses. We think it's also important to remember that small businesses is almost everything that you can think of. Small businesses is anything less than 500 employees, fewer than 500 employees. So that might sound pretty big, but it's still classified as a small business. We're going to spend additional money out in the states and the municipalities. Health providers, as you can imagine, due to the nature of this particular disaster, are going to get a significant amount of money as well. So it's meant to, so that the household stipends that people are expecting to be dispersed pretty soon, that's really meant to be like a first aid. We think of that as disaster response. It's financial first aid, essentially, to help people get through just the immediate upcoming weeks. But in the longer sense, we're hoping to stimulate the economy, helping with businesses and helping other aspects of government. So not just the federal level, the state and the municipal level, to go ahead and try and get through this crazy time that we're all living through. I'm gonna wait for that doorbell to quiet down.
Oh,
okay. All right. So just a real quick summary of everything that we've covered today, and then we're happy to take more of your questions. So disasters are very, very expensive. I know these numbers are like mind-bogglingly huge, that it was about $106 billion on average over the last 5 years. And that our disaster relief fund, which has about $29 billion in it as of last year, can't even cover that. So they're very, very expensive. And because they're very expensive, all stakeholders really do have to find ways to pay for disasters and think about how to pay for disasters throughout the whole cycle. So not just in responding to a disaster, but before it happens, preparing for it and having a plan. We talked about direct and indirect impacts from disaster. So that's also the cost. And indirect in particular can be hard to measure and hard to put a dollar sign on. And we talked about some of the ways that that can start to ripple out and get a little messy. Josh talked about the accounting equation. So how everybody, all stakeholders in their own way, have to balance their assets and liabilities in order to be able to recover from disaster. And to help us along as we do that, the federal government can pass appropriations that can help response, recovery, and also mitigation for future impacts. So thank you for being with us today, and we're going to stick around and take some of your questions. I will hand it back over to Kathy.
great. Thank you both. Okay, so we have a couple of questions. So the first one, I'm going to go backwards here a little bit and work my way back to the first couple of questions. So the first question here is, shouldn't we be rewarding businesses that engage in mitigation and prevention beforehand and not treat them equally with more reckless businesses? And are there such provisions right now?
Josh, do you want to take it, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a interesting question in terms of you know, businesses that what it comes down to is that certain businesses, especially if you're thinking about very small businesses, unfortunately, continuum of operations planning, mitigation planning is somewhat of a luxury in that sense, that they're so preoccupied more so with getting enough cash flow month to month to stay afloat, that oftentimes mitigation, and at least some of the encounters that we've had, you know, around the country talking to small business owners, entrepreneurs, it's not associated as directly in their business plan. And I think we're beginning to change the narrative around that and change the discourse around that to include mitigation planning into the startup phase. You know, what is your business plan? It should include a mitigation strategy, a continuity of operations planning strategy. We're seeing the narrative change in that because of the frequency and the severity of disasters and what it's doing to small business communities. Jackie, I'm not sure if you have anything to add there.
So in general, I think our policies are a little bit behind what we know to be true. And so for instance, we know that response looks really good. A good disaster response looks really good. And so we do tend to reward that. what you don't see is you don't see the disaster that didn't happen, right? You don't see the crisis that was averted. And so it's difficult to incentivize that because it doesn't seem like there's a lot of reward. It doesn't seem like there's as much reward associated with that. And so in terms of the policies that we have in place, so Josh is talking kind of more about what businesses themselves are or maybe aren't able to do based on their own cash flow and their own business model. We are starting to see on a policy level, a little bit of this is starting to change. As we mentioned, now we can actually put disaster money towards mitigation, and that's very, very recent. In terms of climate change, we're also starting to see some ways that in certain industries, businesses are being a little bit incentivized to mitigate the effects of climate change. But change, unfortunately, in this realm is just a little bit behind what we observe to be true.
Great. Thank you both. The next question, do we have any data on how insurance companies apportion funds for claims?
So we've just begun really looking in and diving into the insurance claims and the data associated with that. One finding, and it's publicly accessible data. It's a data set that might be of interest if you're looking into, how do these funding streams, eventually work for individuals, households, and businesses, is actually coming from the Small Business Administration. So through the Center for Public Integrity, if I'm remembering correctly, and I can follow up, they had the data set for SBA loans, Small Business Administration loans. It's a very common funding source post-disasters for a lot of these small businesses as well as individuals. And what this data set shows are some of the top 10 codes that people are being denied these loans after disaster. And off the top of my head, the top three, I think the first and foremost, and one of the most critical ones that has our whole center's attention in terms of economic recovery is credit history. So it goes right and directly links back to why liabilities are so important to these conversations. Is a lot of these loans are being denied because of previous credit history or lack of ability to repay on a loan. So there's I think insurance has been like a hot topic in terms of trying to figure out can we get access to that data, what would we do with that data, but more of this application data is coming to the forefront.
Great, thank you. Do we know how much was invested in prevention and mitigation of epidemics after the 2009 swine flu outbreak, which affected about 60 million Americans?
I don't have a dollar amount for that. I don't know if you do, Josh. So how much was invested? And I'm assuming your question is on the federal level, because I'm sure that there's different amounts in the private sector in terms of researching technologies and other ways to combat spread of illness. But on the federal level, how much was invested? I don't have a dollar amount on that, unfortunately. I can speak a little bit about in terms of not the dollars, but the other mitigative actions. So after we have a disaster, we usually do see some sort of new action, such as forming a new advisory committee or creating new positions for people who are specifically supposed to be keeping an eye on this and advising high levels of government in the future. We saw this after Hurricane Katrina. We saw an advisory panel was formed and then later disbanded. And we did have, the federal government did have an advisory panel for epidemiological public health concerns, which to my knowledge was disbanded within the last couple of years.
Thank you. And one of the earlier questions, I think, Josh, this was referring back to your diagram about assets, liabilities, and equity. What does negative equity mean? Does it mean that those you owe to won't get paid? If you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, so negative equity, when we run this case studies and some of the trainings that we do around business financial literacy, we actually take a case that goes into negative equity. So it's because eventually what we like to do with the accounting equation, the next tier up would be looking at solvency ratios. So looking at a debt to equity ratio, and because a debt to equity ratio is a really good indicator of how risky an investment is. What we try to do is share the debt to equity ratio with individuals so that they can also calculate, what level of risk are they being perceived as from lenders. But essentially, John, our dear friend John, goes into a negative solvency ratio, and what this means is really he owes a lot more than he owns, and that's going to limit what different funding streams he's going to have access to. And to that question specifics point around, is he not going to be able to pay his staff? The likelihood is he would probably have to go into like some type of forbearance or take out loans to specific loans to pay out staff. So it becomes this perpetual cycle of liabilities just increasing. So you want to avoid that negative solvency ratio as much as possible.
Also, something, Josh, that you just said reminded me of the earlier question about rewarding businesses for investing in mitigation. So it's not happening right now, but in the near future, we're seeing a shift where there is demand from investors and lenders want to know that what they're investing in or who they're lending to is actually more prepared for disasters, and in particular, climate-related disasters. So we are starting to see a shift in terms of the demand for disclosure on, so, Josh is talking about assets and liabilities and risk, and what makes an entity, a person or a business, a risky borrower is their ability to repay or not, and how balanced that spreadsheet is. And so we're just now starting to see kind of some change happening, a little bit here and there. It's probably going to pick up speed really, really quickly. But what we are seeing is we're starting to see, for instance, if a local government wants to borrow money so that they can build an infrastructure project, like a new park or something, and they expect that that's going to help increase property value, and that's how they're going to pay it back. Now we're seeing that the lenders who are potentially going to let them borrow that money want to know, well, what are you going to do to keep your investment safe in the event of disaster, so that we know that you're going to be able to pay this back? And what are you doing to keep your tax base safe in a disaster? So it's not required to disclose disaster or climate risk yet. It may be required disclosure in the future. And in that way, companies or entities that are able to demonstrate that they have invested in mitigation, or that they do have this balanced portfolio, and they have a better credit history, might actually start to benefit more.
And just pressing employers off that point, Jackie, I agree completely. But asking your employers what mitigation strategies do they have? I think coming out of COVID-19, I think that's should be at the forefront of any docket. Is what do we have in place should something similar ever happen again, and to avoid layoffs, to avoid this increase in liabilities, uncertainties, and things like that. So I don't think there's anything wrong with asking your employer what their plan is.
Not at all. I read something that was like a human resources blog, and it said, make this an interview question for all future job interviews. Ask, what did your company do during the COVID-19 pandemic? Because unlike most disasters, this is affecting almost everybody across the board. Most disasters, you can't compare, but this is something, it's going to be a benchmark.
I think that's a great conclusion to this presentation. Do the presenters have anything else they'd like to add? Any final thoughts? Okay. For our participants, if you do have follow-up questions, please just send me those questions directly, and I'll pass them along to our presenters. I just wanted to remind you that if you do have feedback as well about our sessions, please feel free to email me directly. Thank you again for joining us today. We will share the video of this recording when it is ready, probably later this week or early next week at the latest. thank you very much again. And thank you, Josh and Jackie, for your time and for sharing your knowledge with us today.
Thanks for coordinating, Cassie. It's been really fun.
Yeah, it's
Thanks,
been great.
everybody.
All right.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of the afternoon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.